Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you all again today as we continue to explore these realizations of great beings. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, okay. Wonderful. So, I have begun these talks with a reflection on great beings and what great beings means. There was a period in my life where I considered great beings to be those with a lot of athletic prowess. So I would look up to certain football players, basketball players, baseball players. I would consider them great beings, and I really aspired to want to be like them. And there was a time in my life where I had a kind of transformation of values where I started to view the world differently. I started to think of what was most important to me differently. And I began to understand that great beings, I kind of recategorized that into someone who has compassion, who has love in their heart, who makes a genuine effort to alleviate suffering, whether that's in themselves or in other beings, who has the capacity to look deeply into the nature of life, who doesn't look away from suffering, but can extend their hands to bring benefit to beings. So shifting that perspective of great beings, we can look at and consider great beings as teachers on the path, as people who have cultivated qualities in their life, in their mind, in their consciousness to benefit others, to bring generosity, to bring love, to bring compassion and peace, more of that into the world. These are people that I consider great beings. So I would like to review a few of these 8 realizations that I've been going through in this series of talks. The first realization is that the world is impermanent. The second realization is that more desire brings more suffering. The third realization is the awareness that the human mind is always searching outside itself and never feels fulfilled. The fourth realization is the awareness that indolence or laziness is an obstacle to practice. So these 4 realizations are things that I have been reflecting on and working to deepen my understanding of. And they're also bells of mindfulness to help us to be present, to really look deeply into what's happening in our lives and in the world so that we can act with compassion, with understanding. So I'm going into the next 2 realizations here. The next 2 realizations are the 5th and 6th ones. So the 5th realization is the awareness that ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death. And the 6th realization is the awareness that poverty creates hatred and anger, which creates a vicious cycle of negative thoughts and actions. So I wanted to start by prompting you all, quizzing you all, to see what you all think of this 5th realization first. To me, this one seems a little bit less clear and a little bit harder to penetrate into, to unlock the mysteries therein. So I'm curious what you all think after having come fresh from this meditation, this experience of perhaps timelessness and peace. What do you all think that this realization means? The awareness that ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death. What does that mean? So I'll invite you all to bow in if you have the courage and bravery to see what you think that means. Ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death. And then I will listen to you all, and I will give my reflections, perspectives on this So, what do you all think that means? Ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death. So, I'll bow out. Feel free to bow in if you'd like and share any reflections you have on that first realization.
Hold on. I think it means that we're here seeking knowledge, that we're all on a quest to learn things, and that's part of our journey here. Thinking about
Neil bowing in. What's the question again?
The question is, the fifth realization is the awareness that ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death. So the question is, what does that mean? What do you think that means?
Well, I would say yes, we're just present. I really don't know what it means, but it would, well, ignorance, that would be the main word to look at. Uh, but, the cause of birth and death, according to the book that we're currently reading for the book club, is a combination of always striving or desire, as you mentioned, and I think harming others, but I'm not so sure. But so, well, I don't know if you're going to mention karma, but that's what we've been reading about. So your karma, until you have reached a sort of peace or understanding, you will stop having to go around this birth and death cycle. That once you kind of are at peace and are no longer striving, desiring, then you will end that birth and death cycle. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Paula bowing in. I believe that it could mean that if we do not look inside and see that we are a sum of the five aggregates and like we are an ever-flowing river and there's no fixed permanent self, then there is no chance to escape the hamster wheel, the life and death of suffering. And once we look deeply and we see that we are like a flow, then that helps us be aware of the impermanence and no self and achieve a certain state of awakening and get to what is for some nirvana, which is the absence of concept, the absence of suffering, and we take things more lightly. I think that's what it could mean. Paula bowing out.
right. Thank you all for sharing. Go ahead and cap that there. Put the lid on there. So, thank you for that reflection. Ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death. In our practice, we want to strive to overcome ignorance. We want to, this word ignorance, it means kind of ignoring something or dwelling in delusion. We know the truth is out there, but we choose to live in ignorance. We choose not to see it. There's an element of our mindfulness practice can help us to understand something about the nature of life so that we can overcome this sense of ignorance. And in the Buddha's teachings, there are many themes related to suffering. One of the core reasons why we suffer is that we live in this sense of delusion that we have this separate self, that we have a self that stands separately from the rest of existence. But when we look deeply within ourselves, we can see that there is no separate self. Kind of like Paula said, that what we see as ourself is made up of these different aggregates, these different things that are in a state of constant change. So we might think of birth as this concrete event and death as this concrete event. When we look more deeply inside, we can see that even those categories, birth and death, something has to come before something is born, and something continues on after one dies. There is this sense of emptiness that we are working to realize so that we don't dwell in this ignorance about birth and death, that we're caught in this constant cycle that causes so much suffering that's ongoing. So this realization continues. The awareness that ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death, and that bodhisattvas always listen to and learn from others so their understanding and skillful means can develop, and so they can teach living beings and bring them great joy. So, listening to you all and learning from your stories, listening to the nature of reality, listening to these different aspects of the Dharma, can help us to develop understanding and skillful means. There is a tenet in some Zen traditions where the first component of helpful, compassionate action is not knowing, is letting go of our concepts. If we cling too much to our concepts, we may miss the mark and we may miss the opportunity to teach beings and bring them great joy. It's important to let go of our knowledge of our concepts, at least for a moment, so that we can really understand what the situation is, so that we can then teach living beings in a way that they can listen and understand and bring them great joy. This last component, bringing beings great joy, one of my favorite books by Thich Nhat Hanh is called Old Path, White Clouds, and it's a story of Siddhartha Gautama becoming the Buddha and his path of generating the way of Buddhism that we are practicing in this room to this day. The practice of peace, nonviolence, mindfulness, bringing that into our awareness. I'll tell a few stories from that book when I come to the next realization in a few minutes. But one of the themes that I remember from that book is when the Buddha is teaching people, there's this moment where their face lights up. They have this new awakening, this new awareness, and they feel this great joy emanating from the Buddha, from his practice. Some of us may have had that experience ourselves when we're either listening to a Dharma talk and we feel this great sense of joy at some kind of realization that we have because of what the person's sharing with us. Or maybe it's the flip side. We've said something to someone and it really opens their heart, opens their mind, and they can experience this state of great joy. It can be a lovely thing when we have that opportunity to teach living beings and bring them great joy. I really appreciate that aspiration. As a result of overcoming our ignorance, of working to dwell in this wisdom of interbeing and interconnectedness, we can do things and live in such a way that brings beings joy. So I'd like to close this reflection on this realization with a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh. This poem is called Recommendation, and this is one poem that brings me great joy. So here it is. Recommendation by Thich Nhat Hanh. Promise me this day, promise me now, while the sun is overhead exactly at the zenith. Promise me, even as they strike you down with a mountain of hatred and violence, even as they step on you and crush you like a worm, even as they dismember and disembowel you, remember, brother, remember, man is not our enemy. The only thing worthy of you is compassion, invincible, limitless, unconditional. Hatred will never let you face the beast in man. One day, when you face this beast alone, with your courage intact, your eyes kind, untroubled, even as no one sees them, out of your smile will bloom a flower. I'm still working on that one. Flowers blooming out of my mouth. Someday I might get there. And those who love you will behold you across 10,000 worlds of birth and dying. Alone again, I will go on with bent head, knowing that love has become eternal. On the long, rough road, the sun and moon will continue to shine. I really love that line. And those who love you will behold you across 10,000 worlds of birth and dying. So we started out this realization with this awareness that ignorance is the cause of the endless round of birth and death. Some of us may feel that we're old souls, that we've been around for a long time, that we've been through this round of thousands of births and deaths. But there's this phrase, those who love you will behold you across 10,000 worlds of birth and dying. That sense of a loving smile, a loving presence, being there through all of our struggles, through all of our sufferings, being there waiting for us, supporting us, not allowing us to drown in despair. It's a very touching sentiment, and it's something that I have experienced myself on the practice. So, I'd like to request a sound of the bell before I delve into the sixth realization. I think it's Cornell over there. Would you mind ringing the bell for me?
Did you hear it, Nick?
Barely. But thank you for sounding the bell. So, the sixth realization, I would say this is a pretty nice segue from that poem where Thich Nhat Hanh presented some of these violent images where they will strike you down with a mountain of hatred and violence, even as they step on you and crush you like a worm. Where is that coming from? Well, we know that Thai lived through the Vietnam War and experienced great suffering and witnessed great suffering as a result of that. So the sixth realization is the awareness that poverty creates hatred and anger, which creates a vicious cycle of negative thoughts and actions. Poverty creates hatred and anger, which creates a vicious cycle of negative thoughts and actions. So a few components to cover in this. is that poverty is a very real thing that exists in our societies. Even in those societies which are very wealthy and first world countries, there's still a great deal of poverty. The sense of not having enough to eat, not having clean water, of having to fight for one's survival, of feeling that you have to work ceaselessly, nonstop, that being able to go on a retreat, that being able to go on a vacation is a privilege that is not affordable or not doable. These are some of the conditions of poverty that are there. When I think of poverty, I think of industries that have a history of exploiting or profiting off of those who are poor or those who are in poverty. And when we look at the second mindfulness training, true happiness, it starts out aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression. I'm committed to practicing generosity in my thinking, speaking, and acting. So again, not dwelling in ignorance, not ignoring the suffering that is out there as a result of poverty and the systems that it creates. We can see that there are many profitable industries that do exploit the poor. We can look into industries such as certain meat industries that bring in immigrant families and workers and work them basically to the bone, having them do this difficult work of slaughtering animals, and also putting them in charge of kind of the legal repercussions that come as a result of working in meat industries. We can look at war industries that have a tendency to send people in poverty off into situations of active conflict and violence. There's situations where loved ones that I have known before have had the history of being swept up and stolen from their families and shipped off to war in foreign lands without being asked whether or not they wanted to go. You can see how an experience of going to other countries and being forced to kill other people that you do not know could create a vicious cycle of hatred and anger, of negative thoughts and actions. And if you look at the way many societies are structured, it's not hard to see that sometimes those in positions of power do use those at the bottom or closer to the bottom of society for their own well-being, for their own benefit, often putting them in situations of immense suffering and pain. Even here in Joliet, near where I live, you can go to the steel mill down the road from my house, and it often says that immigrant workers were made to work the hardest jobs, where they risked losing limbs, losing hands, being thrown into pits of molten lava. It sounds a lot like Lord of the Rings there, but being in really difficult, painful circumstances over and over again, seeing coworkers near them die. So poverty creates hatred and anger, which creates a vicious cycle of negative thoughts and actions. It is Black History Month, and I'm enjoying reading this book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which Bobby recommended to me. And there is a passage in it where during the Union Army, before the Civil War, wealthy men could avoid the draft by paying $300 or hiring a substitute. Anger rose among Irish working-class men in particular who couldn't afford to buy their way out of a war they felt they had no stake in. They saw it as risking their lives to defend Southern slaves who would, in their minds, come north and only become competition for them. As it was, the Irish were already competing with former slaves in New York, whose very presence undercut the wages of working-class whites because blacks had little choice but to accept lower pay for whatever work they did. So as a result of these rising tensions during the Civil War drafting, the Irish workers ended up rioting and killing many black workers. And so you can see just this situation where people are trying to exist and striving to exist at some of the lower rungs of society, and there's so much hatred and anger which is there, this competition, this fighting. And so it's important to realize that that is the case, to not look away in ignorance, to not pretend like our system that we're in is not creating this exploitation and social injustice. We can look into a number of other industries, go on a long list of seeing the social injustices and stealing that has been created. But it's something to contemplate and reflect on in our lives. How can I do my best to not contribute to those systems that are creating suffering? I think one part of it is decreasing our sense of desire, decreasing our constant grasping and running after things, living simply in the present moment, as Thich Nhat Hanh said. So I would like to tell, so the sixth realization goes on with a few more sentences. So after it says, poverty creates hatred and anger, which creates a vicious cycle of negative thoughts and actions. It says, when practicing generosity, bodhisattvas consider everyone, friends and enemies alike, to be equal. They do not condemn anyone's past wrongdoings or hate even those presently causing harm. They do not condemn anyone's past wrongdoings or hate even those presently causing harm. So, I'd like to share a few reflections on these next few components. Practicing generosity is an extremely important quality in our practice. When we look at the 6 paramitas in Buddhism, which are things that help us to get to the other shore, to transform our suffering, the first paramita is generosity. There are even some views that generosity is more important to practice and focus on than meditation. Oftentimes we want to experience these peaceful, blissful states in meditation, but focusing on generosity and thinking how we can live our lives in a more generous way can also lead us to the other shore, can also transform a great deal of suffering. What can I give to others to benefit them? So, a few examples of this. These are stories from the book Old Path, White Clouds that I mentioned before. We have the story of the Buddha and Sunita, which I would like to read some components of. So, one day, as the Buddha and bhikkhus were begging in a village near the banks of the Ganga, the Buddha spotted a man carrying night soil. The man was an untouchable named Sunita. So this is a man at the lowest caste of society. We may think that the caste system is unique to India, but if we look deeply into the level of classism that is here in our current society, we may be able to see that there are certain groups of people that have been considered untouchables in the past. So the man was an untouchable named Sunita. Sunita had heard about the Buddha and bhikkhus, but this was the first time he had ever seen them. He was alarmed, knowing how dirty his clothes were and how foul he smelled from carrying night soil. He quickly moved off the path and made his way down the river. But the Buddha was determined to share the way with Sunita. When Sunita veered from the path, the Buddha did the same. Understanding the Buddha's intent, Sariputta and Meghiya, the Buddha's attendant at the time, followed him. The rows of other bhikkhus came to a halt and they quietly watched. Sunita was panic-stricken. He hastily put the buckets of night soil down and looked for a place to hide. Above him stood the bhikkhus in their saffron robes, while before him approached the Buddha and 2 other bhikkhus. Not knowing what else to do, Sunita waded up to his knees in water and stood with his palms joined. Curious villagers came out of their homes and lined the shore to watch what was happening. Sunita had veered off the path because he was afraid he would pollute the bhikkhus. So as you can see, as a result of his poverty, he internalized this sense of inferiority and despair. He could not have guessed the Buddha would follow him. Sunita knew that the Sangha included many men from noble castes. He was sure that polluting a bhikkhu was an unforgivable act. He hoped the Buddha and bhikkhus would leave him and return to the road, but the Buddha did not leave. He walked right up to the water's edge and said, "My friend, please come closer so that we may talk." Sunita, his palms still joined, protested, "Lord, I don't dare." "Why not?" asked the Buddha. "I am an untouchable. I don't want to pollute you and your monks." The Buddha replied, "On our path we no longer distinguish between castes. You are a human being like the rest of us. We are not afraid we will be polluted. Only greed, hatred, and delusion can pollute us. A person as pleasant as yourself brings us nothing but happiness. What is your name?" "Lord, my name is Sunita." "Sunita, would you like to become a bhikkhu like the rest of us?" "I couldn't. Why not? I am an untouchable." And so the Buddha continues and invites Sunita, this untouchable, into his caste. The Buddha is creating this new form of society where those at the lowest rungs and those at the highest rungs can exist in harmony together, in peace together. It's a pretty profound notion, and we can think about how we can bring that into our own lives. The chapter goes on to say that Sunita coming into the Sangha as an untouchable created an uproar around him from the higher castes, kind of questioning the Buddha. How could he possibly bring someone from the lower castes into his Sangha, into his community? I don't think the Buddha really cared much about what other people thought. He was living from a place of heart and doing his best to build this beloved community, which echoes into this moment today in the Taoist Meditation Center. I'd like to tell one last story around so this realization: they do not condemn anyone's past wrongdoings or even hate those presently causing harm. Once again, it can be really hard to not want to condemn someone who's done something wrong, especially when they do something wrong repeatedly and do actions that cause a lot of harm and are currently doing things that cause a lot of harm. It says bodhisattvas do not condemn anyone, and they don't hate anyone. This can seem like a high ideal. How do we bring this into our lives? So I'd like to tell this story of the Buddha and Angulimala, which you may have heard before. After this, we'll have some time for sharing and reflection. So Angulimala, Anguli means finger, and Mala means like necklace. Angulimala was a murderer who, after he killed someone, would chop off their finger and place it on a necklace around him. So he had this garland of, some stories say, hundreds of fingers that he was wearing around his neck, going from village to village, killing people and taking their fingers. So the Buddha was practicing in a village, and word was coming that Angulimala was on his way to make an attack. And so all of the village people fled back into their homes, except for the Buddha. The Buddha is this figure who embodies non-fear. And so the Buddha continued to walk mindfully, peacefully down the path, knowing that Angulimala was coming. Many people shouted from their homes, "Get back in, get to safety, run away." The Buddha ignored them and continued walking peacefully on the path. Angulimala approached the Buddha from behind. You could think of him, his eyes are red, he's ready to kill. He's got this anger and hatred stirring within him. And he calls out to the Buddha, "Contemplative, stop." The Buddha keeps walking peacefully and mindfully. Angulimala starts sprinting after the Buddha, but he doesn't seem to be making any progress in catching up to him. It's an interesting image there flipped, where you saw Sunita was running away from the Buddha because he thought he was too poor and he was too unworthy, and the Buddha continued to follow him, paralleling him, not letting him go. And in this flipped instance, the murderer is running after the Buddha, and the Buddha is simply walking mindfully. So Angulimala says, "Stop. Contemplative, stop." And eventually the Buddha turns around and he says, "Angulimala, I have stopped. It is you who have not stopped on the path of creating suffering and pain for beings." And when the Buddha said that to Angulimala, he froze, and there was this moment of his heart awakening. The awakening heart. The Buddha could have said, "Let's arrest him, let's throw him in jail, let's put him to death because of all the pain he's caused." But there's something about seeing the worth in someone. Now, I don't think that people should necessarily just be let out of prison. I think, when it comes to violent crime, that is something that does create a lot of turmoil and suffering in society. But in this example, the Buddha saw that there was opportunity in Angulimala, and he invited him into his Sangha. He said, "Will you take the 5 mindfulness trainings?" And Angulimala basically said, "Yes, I will. I'm open to it." And in very short time, Angulimala transformed his anger and hatred from being such a vicious person to experiencing a great deal of peace and loving kindness, to the point where when the local police force came running after looking for Angulimala, they didn't even notice him in the Buddha's Sangha because he had become so peaceful. Probably also threw away his necklace filled with people's fingers. So we come back to these qualities of realizing wisdom to combat ignorance, the wisdom of interbeing, interconnectedness, impermanence, non-self, and also the realization of the importance of generosity because of the characteristics and qualities that poverty create. We've also discussed being open to others' views, perspectives, learning from others, and not condemning people's past wrongdoings, but trying to love them. And with that, I will go ahead and close. Thank you all so much for listening. I look forward to hearing what you have to say in the sharing.
Thank you so much, Nick. Amazing topic and stories. Just to affirm the depths of Nick's transformation, he preferred to be with us today instead of watching the great beings playing in the Super Bowl and talking with us about those other great beings. So thank you for that, Nick.